In the early hours before dawn on August 14, 1994, a squad of covert operatives moved in silence through the sultry night air of Khartoum, Sudan. Their footsteps padded across the floor of a quiet villa as they closed in on a sleeping target. Inside, the man known worldwide as Carlos the Jackal lay recovering from minor surgery, unaware that his luck had finally run out. In an instant, masked men burst into the room and pinned him to his bed. The startled fugitive, one of the world's most wanted terrorists for over 2 decades, struggled only briefly before a doctor plunged a syringe into his arm, sedating him. Within minutes, the unconscious prisoner was whisked away to a waiting jet and spirited off to Paris under heavy guard, ending an international manhunt that had spanned nearly 20 years. The legend of Carlos the Jackal, elusive mastermind of bombings, hijackings, and assassinations, had finally been brought to justice in a most unremarkable way. Tranquilized in his pajamas and handed over by the very nation that had sheltered him, this dramatic capture would mark the culmination of a global pursuit of a man whose life reads like a thriller, except every twist in this tale is true. Carlos the Jackal was born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez in Venezuela on October 12, 1949. From the very beginning, ideology coursed through his veins. His father, a wealthy lawyer and fervent Marxist, insisted on naming him Ilich in honor of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, despite his devout Catholic mother's objections. In fact, Ramirez Sanchez's 2 younger brothers were pointedly named Lenin and Vladimir, completing their father's homage to the Soviet revolutionary. At home, young Ilich was steeped in communist doctrine almost from the cradle. Family lore holds that he proudly read a biography of Lenin twice before the age of 10, much to his father's delight. By the late 1950s, as a mere boy, he was marching in street protests and absorbing the rhetoric of leftist student movements in Caracas. The turbulent politics of Latin America during the Cold War set the stage for his upbringing. Through his father's tutelage, Ramirez Sanchez came to see himself not just as a curious student, but as a budding soldier in the global class struggle. His parents separated in the mid-1960s, and in 1968 his mother moved with the children to London. Yet, even as a teenager in England, Ramirez Sanchez's path was anything but typical. He studied at elite schools, but his focus remained on revolutionary politics rather than academics. With his father's connections and encouragement, Ilich enrolled at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow in 1969. Lumumba University was infamous as a training ground for international communists, a Soviet institution designed to indoctrinate and equip young radicals from the developing world. It was exactly the sort of place a zealous youth like Ilich could find kindred spirits and professional revolutionary training. But the strict discipline of Soviet campus life held little appeal for the charismatic young man. He was far more interested in Moscow's nightlife than in Marxist-Leninist dialectics. By his own later admission, he spent his Moscow days chasing girls and partying, behaviors that did not sit well with his hosts. Unsurprisingly, within a year, the unruly Venezuelan was expelled from Lumumba University, officially for poor academic performance and indiscipline. Being kicked out of Moscow might have ended another young man's political aspirations, but for Ramirez Sanchez it was merely a pivot point. In the summer of 1970, at age 20, he traveled to the Middle East in search of a new revolutionary cause. Drawn by the plight of the Palestinians and inspired by classmates' tales of guerrilla warfare against Israel, he made his way to Beirut, Lebanon, and volunteered for the ** Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. The PFLP was a Marxist Palestinian militant organization led by Dr. Wadi Haddad, a man who practically invented airplane hijacking as a terror tactic. Haddad and the PFLP welcomed foreign recruits, and the young Venezuelan was soon undergoing guerrilla training in Jordan's remote deserts. In training camps hidden in the hills, Ramirez Sanchez learned to handle explosives, assault rifles, and pistols, and studied the dark arts of urban sabotage and subterfuge. He proved to be an apt pupil. Years later, Haddad would recall recognizing a special talent in the stocky South American. It was Haddad, by some accounts, another PFLP official, Bassam Abu Sharif, who bestowed upon Ilich the nom de guerre Carlos, a simple name chosen, legend has it, for its Latin flavor and ease of use. With that code name, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez began his new life as an international revolutionary. By the early 1970s, Carlos was on the front lines of international militancy. He cut his teeth fighting alongside Palestinian guerrillas during the Black September conflict in Jordan in 1970, battling pro-Western forces and earning a reputation for courage under fire. After the PFLP and other Palestinian groups were expelled from Jordan, Carlos followed his mentors to Lebanon and eventually returned briefly to London, ostensibly to take courses at a polytechnic institute. In reality, he was now a clandestine operative, ready to export the PFLP's fight beyond the Middle East. Carlos's first known assignment came in December 1973 inches London, a mission that would announce him to international intelligence agencies, if not yet to the general public. On the evening of December 30th, 1973, Carlos knocked on the door of a stately residence in the upscale neighborhood of St. John's Wood. The home belonged to Joseph Seif, a prominent British Jewish businessman and vice president of the British Zionist Federation. Carlos had identified Seif as a target, a reprisal, he would later claim, for the Mossad's assassination of a PFLP leader in Paris earlier that year. When Seif's housemaid answered the door, the stocky young stranger forced his way in at gunpoint and demanded to be taken to Seif. The businessman was relaxing in his bath when a pistol-wielding Carlos confronted him in the bathroom. Without hesitation, Carlos fired a single shot straight at Seif's face. Incredibly, almost miraculously, the bullet struck Seif just beside the nose and ricocheted off his cheekbone. The would-be assassin's gun jammed after the first shot, giving the wounded but still conscious Seif a chance at life. Dazed and bleeding, Seif slumped, and Carlos, momentarily flustered by the misfire, chose flight over a second attempt. He fled into the night, leaving his target alive and an obvious crime scene behind. Seif would survive the attack, scarred but living proof of how narrowly Carlos's debut operation missed its mark. British authorities initially had no idea who the shooter was. But the audacity of the attempted murder, an armed foreigner brazenly targeting a prominent Jewish figure in the heart of London, put Scotland Yard and MI5 on high alert. Carlos did not remain idle after the failed Seif assassination. In early 1974, he set off a string of smaller attacks, as if determined to prove himself to his PFLP handlers. He later admitted responsibility for a failed bombing of Bank Hapoalim in London, an Israeli bank branch, and for planting car bombs outside 3 French newspapers in Paris that he deemed pro-Israeli. These amateurish bombs caused only minor damage and no fatalities, but they demonstrated Carlos's growing reach. Not long after, in September 1974, a grenade was tossed into the trendy drugstore Publicis Café in Paris, killing 2 people and injuring 34. French investigators would later tie this grenade attack to Carlos's network, noting that the explosive used was traced back to a stolen U.S. military stockpile, and that another grenade from the same lot was discovered in an apartment linked to one of Carlos's lovers. Carlos himself, in an interview with a Middle Eastern magazine, reportedly took credit for the drugstore Publicis bombing, though he would much later deny having made such admissions. Whether or not he personally hurled the grenade, the incident fit the pattern of violence he was weaving across Europe in the name of Palestine and anti-imperialism. By this time, Carlos had cultivated an image as a globe-trotting guerrilla, always on the move and always under a cloud of intrigue. He had also learned the value of false identities. In late 1974, traveling under a stolen passport, Carlos crisscrossed borders to plan his next operation. In fact, one of the few clear photographs of him from this era comes from a fake Peruvian passport bearing the alias Carlos Andrés Martínez Torres *. This passport photo, showing a round-faced Carlos with thick dark hair and a somewhat impassive gaze, would later be reprinted in newspapers worldwide as authorities came to realize that Carlos and Ilich Ramirez Sanchez were one and the same man. His use of multiple aliases and travel documents allowed him to slip across borders that might have been closed to a known terrorist. He was learning to be a chameleon, changing names, appearances, and locales at will, a skill that would frustrate law enforcement for years. A fake passport photograph of Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, under the alias Carlos Andrés Martínez Torres, taken before mid-1974. By the mid-1970 seconds, such images of the man who would be known as Carlos the Jackal were appearing in newspapers worldwide. Carlos's next major strike came in early 1975, and it escalated his notoriety within counterterrorism circles. On January 13th and again on January 17th, 1975, Carlos and a small PFLP cell attempted rocket-propelled grenade attacks on El Al airliners at Orly Airport in Paris. The terrorists lurked near the airport's runways with shoulder-fired RPG-7 launchers, hoping to shoot down the Israeli passenger jets during takeoff. The first attempt misfired or otherwise failed, and undeterred, Carlos returned on the 17th for a second try. This time, airport security spotted the would-be attackers. A chaotic gunfight erupted right in the airport terminals, sending passengers ducking for cover. Cornered and desperate, Carlos and his accomplices grabbed whatever hostages they could and engaged in a tense 17-hour standoff with hundreds of French police and gendarmes. Incredibly, France's Interior Minister, Michel Poniatowski, came to the scene personally as negotiators worked to defuse the crisis. Eventually, under heavy pressure, French authorities agreed to a compromise. Carlos's 3 comrades, along with their weapons, were allowed to board a plane to Baghdad, Iraq, as free men. Carlos himself, however, slipped away amidst the chaos of the gun battle, vanishing before police could apprehend him. The Orly airport saga further burnished Carlos's reputation for near-supernatural luck and ruthlessness. Here was a man who had fired anti-tank rockets at a civilian airliner on European soil, engaged in a firefight with police, taken hostages, and yet managed to escape unharmed. To international investigators, it was now clear that the mysterious Carlos was a serious threat, a terrorist operative capable of striking anywhere and vanishing like a ghost. By mid-1975, multiple governments were actively hunting the shadowy figure known as Carlos. An FBI report that year noted that 2 militants caught in Latin America had Carlos's phone number among their contacts, a clue that even in far-flung places his name was in the air. European and Middle Eastern intelligence agencies were sharing information on this elusive Venezuelan who was fighting for the Palestinian cause. In June 1975, the net appeared to tighten around him in Paris. French detectives from the DST Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, the Domestic Intelligence Service, had been surveilling one of Carlos's contacts, a Lebanese militant named Michel Moukarbel, also known by the code name André. On June 26, 1975, Moukarbel was arrested in Paris. Under interrogation, he cracked and revealed that he was scheduled to meet the infamous Carlos that very evening. Seizing the opportunity, DST agents pressured Moukarbel to lead them to Carlos's hideout in the Latin Quarter of Paris. That night, Moukarbel accompanied 2 unarmed DST officers to a small apartment at 9 Rue Tullier, where Carlos was believed to be attending a party. Inside the apartment, Carlos was indeed mingling with friends and perhaps unsuspecting guests. Accounts differ on the precise narrative of what followed, but the outcome is chillingly consistent. When Moukarbel entered with the 2 agents, Carlos immediately sensed the danger. Ever the actor, he reportedly feigned hospitality at first. Some stories suggest he greeted the officers calmly, even offering them drinks to maintain appearances. But as soon as he had an opportunity, Carlos pulled a pistol from his jacket. In a flash of violence inside the crowded gathering, he opened fire at point-blank range, killing both DST agents on the spot and mortally wounding his turncoat comrade Moukarbel. Pandemonium erupted as partygoers screamed and dove for cover. Amid the confusion, Carlos bolted out into the Paris night, disappearing before backup police could arrive. The brazenness of the Rue Tullier incident was staggering. A wanted man had just gunned down French intelligence officers in the heart of the capital and escaped. French authorities were outraged and embarrassed, and a massive manhunt began immediately. In the aftermath, investigators searched the apartment and discovered a treasure trove that confirmed their worst fears about Carlos's reach. They found bags stuffed with grenades, rifles, and pistols, along with piles of fake passports and documents. No fewer than 6 separate aliases were tied to Carlos at that one location. Even more alarming, they uncovered a handwritten death list containing the names of prominent figures in Britain, many of them Jewish, whom Carlos apparently had marked as targets. It was now undeniable that Carlos was not just a triggerman, but a highly connected terrorist ringleader with international ambitions. The French killings catapulted Carlos the Jackal onto front pages around the world. In the days that followed, his photo, including the fake passport portrait and name, were plastered across newspapers from Caracas to London. A sense of myth began to crystallize around him. When police searched a London safehouse associated with Carlos, they discovered a copy of Frederick Forsyth's novel, The Day of the Jackal, among his belongings. Seizing on the eerie parallel between Forsyth's fictional assassin, codenamed The Jackal, and the real-life fugitive, a correspondent for The Guardian referred to Ramirez Sanchez as Carlos the Jackal. The nickname Carlos the Jackal struck a chord and was soon picked up by media outlets worldwide. It painted an indelible image. Carlos was now the predator, lurking in the shadows, as stealthy and lethal as a jackal in the night. Ironically, the paperback thriller that inspired the moniker likely didn't even belong to him. It was later said to be the apartment owner's book, and there's no evidence Carlos ever read it. Nonetheless, the name stuck, and Ilich Ramirez Sanchez would forever be known as Carlos the Jackal from that moment on. By July 1975, the Jackal was on the run, his cover identities blown, and his face recognizable worldwide. He fled France via Brussels to Beirut within days of the shootings. From the relative safety of Beirut and under the wing of Wadi Haddad's network, Carlos began plotting his most audacious operation yet, one that would make global headlines and solidify his dark legend. That plan materialized in December 1975, when Carlos set his sights on a high-profile target, the OPEC Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, meeting in Vienna, Austria. In the mid-70s, OPEC's oil ministers were gathering periodically to discuss oil policy, and their December summit in Vienna drew top officials from oil-producing nations around the world. Carlos conceived a bold plan to storm the OPEC conference, take hostage the delegations of dozens of countries, and hold the world's oil supply politics at gunpoint. It was a scheme equal parts brutal and theatrical, intended to both avenge perceived betrayals of the Palestinian cause and elevate Carlos's own stature in the pantheon of anti-imperialist fighters. In preparation for the OPEC mission, Carlos spent late 1975 traveling and assembling a team of trusted militants. He moved in and out of East Germany, Hungary, and the Middle East with ease, using the friendly Eastern Bloc borders to hide his movements. According to later reports, during this period, Carlos also made efforts to alter his appearance, ever mindful of the international dragnet closing around him. He shed weight and even underwent plastic surgery in late 1975, reportedly to change his facial features just enough to throw off anyone tracking old photos of him. Having refreshed his disguise, Carlos slipped into Austria by land in mid-December, under yet another false identity. In Vienna, he rendezvoused with a 6-person strike team that he had recruited for the operation. This crew included militants from the German radical left, such as Gabriele Kreucher-Tiedemann of the Revolutionary Cells, as well as Palestinians from the PFLP. They came armed with assault rifles, submachine guns, grenades, and pistols, all smuggled into the city in preparation for the assault. On Sunday, December 21st, 1975, the planned day of the attack, the OPEC oil ministers gathered at the organization's headquarters on Vienna's Dr. Karl Lueger Ring. The atmosphere inside was diplomatic and formal. Representatives from 11 countries were in attendance. Shortly after 11:30 a.m., as the meetings were underway, Carlos and his team brazenly walked through the front entrance of OPEC's building, wearing casual Western attire and carrying their concealed weapons in bags. Without warning, they opened fire in the lobby and corridors. Bullets ripped through the air, and panicked officials dove under tables. In those first violent moments, 3 people were killed: a young Austrian police officer guarding the building, an Iraqi OPEC employee, and a member of Libya's delegation who unfortunately crossed paths with the gunmen. Chaos ensued as the attackers corralled the stunned ministers and delegates. When the shooting stopped, Carlos's team had seized more than 60 hostages, including the oil ministers of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, and others. It was one of the most daring terrorist takeovers the world had yet seen. A multinational kidnapping at the heart of a major international city. Inside the besieged OPEC headquarters, Carlos moved with the swagger of a director in his own deadly play. He separated the hostages into groups, dividing friendly countries from those he deemed enemies. 2 of the most prominent captives, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani and Iranian minister Jamshid Amuzagar, were singled out for particularly harsh treatment. Carlos had declared that these 2 ministers, from the Middle East's biggest pro-Western regimes at the time, were to be executed first to punish their countries for what he saw as betrayals of Palestine. Austrian negotiators, desperate to prevent bloodshed, opened lines of communication. Carlos coolly issued his demands. He insisted that a political statement about the Palestinian cause be read on Austrian national radio and television every 2 hours, and he requested buses and a plane to fly him and his hostages to a friendly country. If any of these conditions were not met, he warned, a hostage would be killed every 15 minutes. Faced with this chilling ultimatum, Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky made the extraordinary decision to accede to some of the terrorists' demands to save lives. Austrian media soon interrupted programming to broadcast a Palestinian communique as instructed. Outside, Viennese police surrounded the OPEC building, but held back from a full assault, fearing a massacre. Within hours, Carlos further demonstrated his flair for publicity and intimidation. At one point during the standoff, he had an intermediary convey a message to police, identifying the mastermind. "I am the famous Carlos. They know me," he bragged to an Arab diplomat dispatched to communicate with authorities. Indeed, by then many intelligence agencies did know him, but they were powerless to intervene without risking the hostages' lives. After some tense negotiation, Carlos achieved one of his key demands. By the morning of December 22nd, the Austrian government provided a bus to transport the captives and terrorists to Vienna's airport. In a surreal convoy, Carlos and his team herded 42 hostages onto the bus, having decided to release a number of lower-value captives beforehand, and along with Austrian police drivers, drove onto the tarmac of Vienna's Schwekat airport. There, a DC-9 jet awaited them. Austrian authorities had agreed, under duress, to let Carlos fly out in exchange for sparing the remaining hostages. The plane took off under Carlos's command, leaving Austria in relief and turmoil. Carlos first directed the flight to land in Algiers, Algeria, a country he presumed would sympathize with the Palestinian cause. In Algiers, he began complex negotiations for asylum. Algerian President Houari Boumediene proved a shrewd mediator. He convinced Carlos to release a total of some 30 hostages upon arrival, including several oil ministers, as a gesture of goodwill. Remarkably, Boumediene managed this without use of force, perhaps leveraging Algeria's status as a radical but non-confrontational supporter of liberation movements. After refueling, Carlos then flew the DC-9 on to Tripoli, Libya, where Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi allowed a brief stop. In Tripoli, additional hostages, mostly those from friendly Arab nations, were freed, reducing the captive count further. The Libyans, however, did not allow the team to stay, so the jet soon returned to Algiers for a final round of talks. Over the course of roughly 48 hours, Carlos negotiated his endgame with the Algerian authorities. Ultimately, Algeria refused to let him murder the two targeted ministers, Yamani and Amuzagar, on its soil, and instead pressed for a peaceful resolution. Exhausted and increasingly cornered, Carlos relented. On December 23rd, he agreed to release the last 11 hostages, including the Saudi and Iranian oil chiefs, in exchange for formal political asylum in Algeria for himself and his team. Just like that, the OPEC siege was over. No dramatic shootout or last stand, but a negotiated surrender of hostages in return for safe haven. 3 people were dead, and the world had held its breath for 2 days, but Carlos had pulled off the operation and lived to fight another day. The OPEC raid made Carlos internationally infamous, a celebrity terrorist, as some newspapers dubbed him, who had thumbed his nose at the combined security forces of Europe and the Middle East. He had held the world's oil ministers at gunpoint and escaped unscathed, which to militant admirers made him a hero of the revolution, and to the rest of the world, a villain of the highest order. Yet behind the scenes, this episode also marked the beginning of Carlos's rift with some of his comrades. The PFLP leadership, including Wadi Haddad, were furious with him. For one thing, Carlos had not actually executed Yamani and Amuzagar as ordered. Whether out of pragmatism or a deal struck with the Algerians, he let those valuable captives live. Rumors also swirled that Carlos might have accepted a cash ransom in exchange for sparing certain hostages or ending the siege. Various sources later claimed that anywhere from 20 to 50 million US dollars was paid by wealthy Gulf states for the safe release of the Saudi and Iranian ministers. If true, such a sum would presumably have been meant for the Palestinian cause. But Haddad and others suspected Carlos of keeping a large cut of the money for himself. A betrayal of the revolutionary code. Carlos denied this, insisting years later that any OPEC ransom money was lost or diverted before it ever reached him. Whatever the truth, distrust had set in. In 1976, Haddad formally expelled Carlos from the PFLP, effectively cutting him off from the organization that had been his militant home. Carlos the Jackal was now a free agent, notorious, well-funded, if the rumors were accurate, and looking to form his own terrorist organization. Cut loose from the PFLP in mid-1976, Carlos set about creating a personal militant network that he grandiosely dubbed the Organization of Arab Armed Struggle. He still had connections, including close ties to militants in German radical circles and various contacts in Middle Eastern intelligence, but he needed a base of operations. In an ironic twist, within months of his headline-grabbing Vienna attack, Carlos quietly approached several governments for support, including those he ostensibly had been fighting against. Shockingly, in September 1976, the notorious terrorist was arrested in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, apparently as he tried to transit the non-aligned communist nation. Instead of extraditing him to the West, however, Yugoslav authorities chose a different path. They bundled Carlos onto a plane to Baghdad, Iraq, and let him go free. It is suspected that Iraq's Ba'athist regime, which had its own enmity with some of Carlos's targets, was willing to harbor him temporarily. From Iraq, Carlos made his way to the People's Democratic Republic of South Yemen, a Marxist state that often welcomed international guerrillas. He found a temporary haven in the capital, Aden, where he convened a meeting of like-minded militants to chart his next moves. By the late 1970s, the Cold War was in full swing, and Carlos cleverly exploited the East-West divide to secure patronage. The oil-rich conservative Arab states wanted him dead. Western Europe's law enforcement wanted him in handcuffs. But the Soviet bloc saw an opportunity. East Germany's Stasi, one of the most formidable intelligence services in the Eastern Bloc, struck a clandestine deal with Carlos. Eager to support anti-imperialist assets who could hurt the West, the Stasi offered Carlos unprecedented support on the condition that he avoid causing them embarrassment. In the late 1970s, Carlos and East German officials forged an alliance. He was allowed to resettle in East Berlin and use it as a headquarters for his operations. The level of assistance he received was almost surreal. According to reconstructed Stasi files, the communist regime provided Carlos with an office in East Berlin, complete with a staff of 75 hand-picked assistants to cater to his needs. These helpers, who ranged from university-educated translators and mechanics to even doctors and actors, furnished him with safe houses, secure telephone lines, and even took care of mundane tasks like keeping his car in perfect running order. The Stasi gave him freedom to move about East Berlin, armed with a pistol. Locals occasionally saw the stout man strolling through the city's squares, pistol on hip, protected by the invisible shield of state security. While Western police agencies were feverishly scouring the globe to track him, Carlos lived openly, if discreetly, in East Berlin, enjoying a charmed life behind the Iron Curtain. During these Berlin years, Carlos consolidated his new organization and deepened alliances with other militant groups. He married Magdalena Kopp, a German left-wing militant who became one of his closest collaborators. They had met through mutual contacts in the radical scene. His inner circle also included Johannes Weinrich, a West German terrorist who effectively became Carlos's second-in-command. Together, they linked up with groups such as the German Red Army faction and the Japanese Red Army, as well as various Middle Eastern factions. Stasi files later revealed that Romania's communist regime under Nicolae Ceausescu may have also given Carlos resources and even commissioned an operation, specifically the 1981 bombing of Radio Free Europe's headquarters in Munich, which was aimed at silencing a critical radio broadcast to the Eastern Bloc. Romania denied this, but Western historians uncovered hints of cooperation. Under the Stasi's patronage, Carlos was effectively a state-sponsored terrorist, given free rein so long as he targeted the West or Israel. There were tacit limits. On at least one occasion, when Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev made a state visit to West Germany in 1981, the KGB asked the Stasi to ensure Carlos refrained from any attacks during that sensitive period. Carlos apparently complied. To the relief of Eastern masters and Western intelligence alike, Brezhnev's visit passed without the expected terror incident. From his East Berlin base, Carlos orchestrated a fresh wave of violence in the early 1980s, determined to free his imprisoned comrades and retaliate against his enemies. His wife, Magdalena Kopp, and close comrade Bruno Breguet were arrested in Paris in February 1982 with a car full of explosives. In response, Carlos issued an ultimatum to France: release Kopp and Breguet or face retaliation. When the French government refused to be cowed, a series of bombings rocked France over the next 18 months. On March 29, 1982, a bomb exploded aboard the Paris-Toulouse high-speed TGV train Le Capitole, killing 5 people and wounding 77. The next month, on April 22, a car bomb devastated the offices of the Arabic-language newspaper Al Watan Al Arabi in Paris, killing 1 person and injuring over 60. This particular magazine had run an interview with Carlos that he wanted retracted. When it refused, it became a target. The carnage continued into the following year. On New Year's Eve, 1983, coordinated bombs detonated in France, one at Marseille's railway station killing 2, injuring 33, and another aboard a TGV train between Marseille and Paris, killing 3, injuring 12. Within days, letters sent to news agencies claimed these attacks in the name of the oppressed, linking them as revenge for French military action against a PFLP camp in Lebanon and as leverage to free Cop and Breguet. In total, this bombing campaign claimed 11 lives and injured over 150 people in France, instilling fear throughout the country. French investigators strongly suspected Carlos's hand in these atrocities, but he remained far beyond their reach in eastern havens. Indeed, in August 1983, Carlos even struck at the French Maison de France Cultural Center in West Berlin, technically Western soil, but right under the nose of his East German hosts. That bomb killed 1 person and injured 22 others. The pattern was clear. Whenever Carlos felt personally aggrieved or sought to pressure a government, innocents were liable to pay the price. By the mid-1980s, however, the Jackal's safe territories were shrinking. International pressure on countries suspected of sheltering Carlos mounted as his attacks continued. Even the tolerant Stasi began to view him as a potential liability. Around 1985, East Germany quietly encouraged Carlos to move on. He found temporary refuge in communist Hungary, living in Budapest's upscale 2nd district for over 2 years. Hungarian authorities tolerated him initially. He lived quietly, supported by funds funneled from patrons like Libya's Gaddafi or the PFLP network via intermediaries. But as Western intelligence traced bomb components and money trails back to Eastern Europe, Hungary too came under diplomatic pressure. In late 1985, Hungary expelled Carlos, making it clear he was no longer welcome to operate on their soil. Carlos tried country after country. He was reportedly denied sanctuary by Iraq, despite earlier ties, turned away by Libya, and even Cuba refused to take him, perhaps not wishing to jeopardize tentative diplomatic feelers with Western nations. Finally, Carlos turned to Syria. In Damascus, the regime of Hafez al-Assad had supported various Palestinian and leftist militant groups, and Syria had a history of using extremists as pawns in regional conflicts. In 1985, Syria agreed to admit Carlos on one condition: he must cease all terrorist activities while on Syrian soil. Exhausted and with few alternatives, Carlos accepted. He settled into a relatively quiet life in Damascus with Magdalena Kopp, who had been released from French prison in 1985, and their young daughter born in 1986 and named Elba Rosa after Carlos's mother. For the remainder of the 1980 seconds, Carlos the Jackal was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, effectively neutralized. Under Syrian protection, he lived comfortably but was kept on a short leash. The Assad government had no intention of letting him jeopardize Syria's strategic interests. Internationally, it was widely assumed that Carlos had been retired, either out of fear of capture or because his cause had lost support. Geopolitically, times were changing. The Cold War was winding down, the Soviet Union was weakening, and Arab states like Syria were recalibrating their alliances. In 1990, when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait and set off the Gulf War, Syria astonishingly sided with the U.S.-led coalition against Iraq. The old order of hardline Arab rejectionism was shifting, and Carlos found himself on the wrong side of the political winds. In September 1991, shortly after the Gulf War, Syria's regime abruptly expelled Carlos from Damascus, likely as a gesture to improve relations with the West and to show it was cracking down on rogue elements. After 6 years in comfortable limbo, the Jackal was back out in the wild, without a den. Carlos, now in his early 42s, scrambled to find a new refuge. He first turned up in Jordan in 1991, but the Jordanian authorities, wary of harboring a notorious terrorist, swiftly sent him on his way. He spent the next year or two wandering between sympathetic contacts in the region. By this time, the world had changed dramatically from the 1970s heyday of international Marxist terror. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Eastern Bloc was gone, and many former benefactors were now either powerless or uninterested in aiding a relic like Carlos. He eventually made a fateful choice. he accepted an offer of shelter in Sudan, an African nation that in the early 1990s was emerging as a gathering place for Islamist and anti-Western figures. In Sudan's capital, Khartoum, the influential Islamist leader Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi was hosting a conference of revolutionaries and positioning Sudan as a haven for those cast out elsewhere. Carlos arrived in Khartoum sometime around late 1992 or 1993, under Turabi's protection. Sudan at that time also hosted radical figures like Osama bin Laden, who was building a base there, though there's no indication Carlos and bin Laden crossed paths. Their contemporaneous presence in Khartoum is a telling sign of Sudan's role as a 1992 terror haven. For a time, Carlos lived quietly in Khartoum, attempting to keep a low profile. He had parted ways with Magdalena Kopp by then. She had taken their daughter and returned to Venezuela, effectively ending their marriage. In Sudan, Carlos remarried. His second wife was a young Palestinian woman named Lana Gerard. By all accounts, Carlos, now aging and perhaps mellowed, yearned to start a new family. However, he had a medical issue hindering that goal, a varicocele that was causing a low sperm count. On the advice of a doctor, Carlos opted for a surgical procedure in Khartoum in early August 1994 to correct this issue, essentially a minor testicular operation. It was a decision made for personal reasons, but it created a moment of vulnerability that his enemies were waiting for. While Carlos convalesced in a hospital, Sudanese officials quietly informed French intelligence of the opportunity to seize him. Unbeknownst to Carlos, Western intelligence operatives had been closing in on him for some time in Sudan. In 1993, a CIA team led by veteran covert operative Billy Waugh had deployed to Khartoum to hunt for the legendary terrorist. Waugh spent months on the ground, surveilling suspects and trying to confirm Carlos's presence. Eventually, by early 1994, the CIA identified a heavy-set man living under tight security in a quiet Khartoum neighborhood as the likely target. They tracked one of Carlos's personal bodyguards to an apartment building and set up an observation post in an abandoned hospital across the street. There, over several months, they monitored the routines of the man who could only be Carlos, noting his comings and goings, his habits, and crucially, when he might be unguarded. By mid-1994, the CIA had handed over detailed surveillance intelligence to the French DST, who were even more eager to capture their long-elusive nemesis. The French government, led by Interior Minister Charles Pasqua, and with the External Intelligence Agency DGSE, began intense negotiations with Sudan's Islamist regime to hand Carlos over. Sudan's leadership was reluctant. In their cultural code, a guest given refuge was not to be betrayed. Sheikh al-Turabi initially rebuffed French requests for extradition, claiming he could not turn over someone who had fought for Palestine. The French persisted with a mix of diplomacy and incentives. They offered Sudan lucrative carrots, promises of much-needed economic aid, communications equipment, and help in clearing Sudan's crippling foreign debt in negotiations with the World Bank and IMF. Behind closed doors, they also shared surveillance footage captured by Billy Waugh's team, allegedly showing Carlos living a playboy lifestyle in Khartoum, drinking alcohol and womanizing. This was a savvy move, as it deeply offended Turabi's Islamist sensibilities, shattering the image of Carlos as an austere revolutionary. Turabi reportedly began to see his guest not as an ideological freedom fighter, but as an embarrassing liability, a hoodlum, in Turabi's words, who was flouting the conservative values of his hosts. Combined with the promised financial incentives, this personal offense tipped the scales. The Sudanese agreed to cooperate covertly in delivering Carlos to the French, as long as it could be done in a deniable way. Thus, the stage was set for the final capture. On the night of August 13, 1994, shortly after Carlos's minor surgery, a Sudanese officer approached him in the hospital. He warned Carlos that there was an alleged assassination plot against him, and for his safety, the government would move him to a more secure location. Trusting his Sudanese hosts, Carlos agreed. He was moved to a guarded villa in Khartoum, ostensibly for his protection. His wife Lana went home to collect some belongings, and ominously never returned. In the early pre-dawn hours of August 14th, as Carlos slept in a guarded bedroom, a team of Sudanese security agents, possibly including some of his own bodyguards who had been turned, entered the room. In a perfectly orchestrated ambush, they pounced on the sleeping man, pinning down the groggy 4-year-old before he could reach for any weapon. Within seconds, a doctor was ushered in and swiftly injected a tranquilizer into Carlos's arm. the Jackal was caught. The Sudanese, keen to keep their hands technically clean, made it appear as if Carlos's own men had betrayed him. The bound, sedated prisoner was then quietly driven to Khartoum's airport, where a French military jet waited on the tarmac. As dawn broke, Carlos the Jackal, sedated, handcuffed, and blindfolded, was carried aboard the plane, which immediately took off for France. After 20 years of eluding the world's law enforcement, the once fearsome terrorist was now a captive in foreign hands, taken without a shot fired. The French government announced the stunning news on August 15, 1994. Carlos the Jackal had been captured. There was a palpable sense of relief, triumph, and even disbelief across capitals in Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. Carlos was arguably the most notorious international fugitive since World War II, a man synonymous with Cold War terrorism. Now he was en route to a prison cell in Paris. French authorities had cleverly sidestepped legal complications by having a judge issue a domestic arrest warrant for Carlos just days earlier, accusing him of a 1979 attack on French soil, a warrant that conveniently allowed France to take custody without an extradition treaty. Though the operation was essentially an extrajudicial rendition, many in the world saw it as justified. Venezuela, Carlos's birth country, made some noise about French violations of international law and his citizenship rights. But these protests gained little traction. The victims of Carlos's crimes, from France to Israel to Lebanon to Britain, simply felt that at long last justice might be served. Upon arriving in France, the Jackal was immediately transferred to the high-security La Santé prison in Paris. The French wasted no time in preparing him for trial. The first case on the docket was the oldest, the murders of the two DST agents and Moukarbel back in 1975 at Rue Tuileries in Paris. This was a deeply symbolic trial for the French, since it was the blood of their own officers that had cemented Carlos's infamy. Proceedings began in Paris on December 12, 1997, more than 22 years after the crime. Carlos, now 48 years old, had spent 3 years behind bars, awaiting this reckoning. He entered the courtroom under heavy guard, defiant and full of theatrical bravado. The man who once was lean, clean-shaven, and sporting a Che Guevara-style beret in his militant youth, now cut a very different figure. He had gained weight, his hair was thinning and graying at the temples. He sported a thick, gray-flecked beard and wore reading glasses on a cord. Dressed in an ordinary anorak jacket, he looked more like a pudgy, middle-aged professor than the sleek jackal of legend. Observers noted that he bore little resemblance to the photographs from his 1970 seconds heyday. The result, in part, of deliberate efforts to change his looks. It emerged that while on the run, Carlos had indeed resorted to plastic surgery to alter his appearance and evade detection. The trademark square jaw and slick black hair, seen in old wanted posters, had subtly changed. Now, he had a softer, heavier face and a receding hairline. Time, and perhaps a surgeon's scalpel, had conspired to make him harder to recognize. Nonetheless, there was no doubt the man in the dock was Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. Ever the showman, Carlos wasted no opportunity to grandstand during his trial. When asked to state his profession, he proudly declared **, professional revolutionary, in the Leninist tradition. **, he asserted that he had been granted Palestinian citizenship by Yasser Arafat for his contributions to the cause. At one point, seeing a supporter in the courtroom gallery, Carlos stood up and raised a clenched fist salute, grinning and pumping his fist, a gesture of communist solidarity that drew gasps and some scattered clapping. The judges were not amused by these antics and cautioned him to behave. Carlos also launched into tirades against Israel, at one moment denouncing the racist Zionist state with such ferocity that some young men in the audience applauded, earning a reprimand from the court. To the end, Carlos cast himself as an ideological warrior. When one wages war for 30 years, there's a lot of blood spilled. Mine and others, he told the court, unapologetic. **, we never killed anyone for money, but for a cause, the liberation of Palestine. **, this rhetoric did little to sway the jury charged with judging crimes of cold-blooded murder on French soil. The 8-week trial culminated just before Christmas 1997. After hearing from dozens of witnesses and a deluge of evidence linking Carlos to the 1975 murders, the French jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On the 23rd of December 1997, Carlos the Jackal was found guilty on all counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, the maximum under French law. For the families of the slain agents, and for France, it was a moment of closure, long delayed. Carlos took the verdict with a clenched jaw and promptly announced plans to appeal, which he lost. In a final flourish of drama, he gave a rambling 4-hour statement before sentencing, declaring the trial illegitimate and calling himself a combatant, not a criminal. But the time for guerrilla theatrics was over. He left the courtroom in shackles, destined for a tiny cell. The 1997 conviction was not the end of Carlos's legal battles. French prosecutors next turned their attention to the string of 1,982 bombings that had killed and maimed so many. In November 2011, Carlos was put on trial again in Paris, this time to face charges for 4 terrorist bombings in 1982 and 1983. Attacks on trains and public places that killed 11 people and injured nearly 200. The now 62-year-old Carlos, grayer and heavier, entered court in 2011 with the same audacity. He was again flanked by his longtime lawyer, who by now was also his wife, after a 2001 prison marriage, Isabelle Coutant-Perry. During this trial, evidence of his involvement, witness testimony, Stasi archives, and his own past statements was presented in painstaking detail. Carlos, for his part, denied involvement in the bombings, even launching a short hunger strike to protest his unfair incarceration. But these gestures changed nothing. In December 2011, the court convicted Carlos for the 1,982-83 bombings and handed him a second life sentence. Carlos appealed, prompting a retrial in 2013, but the verdict was upheld. Then, in March 2017, Carlos was tried yet again, this time for the 1,974 drugstore publicist grenade attack in Paris, a case that had remained technically unresolved for decades. Evidence linking him to that bombing included the unique grenades recovered and an interview he'd allegedly given boasting of the attack. Carlos, as usual, denied it, claiming the interview was fabricated. But after a brief trial, he was found guilty and given a third life sentence on the 28th of March 2017. With that, the once globe-trotting Jackal had been judicially caged for all his major crimes. As of today, he remains incarcerated in France's Clairvaux prison, aging and unrepentant. Over the years behind bars, Carlos has shown no remorse. If anything, he has continued to embrace a self-image as a revolutionary ideologue. In the early 2000s, he converted from Marxism to Islam, reportedly inspired by the global rise of Islamist militancy, and even wrote a book titled Revolutionary Islam, In it, he attempted to link Marxist class struggle with Islamic jihad, and praised figures like Osama bin Laden as the new vanguard of anti-imperialism. He also carried on a bizarre correspondence with Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez, who on a few occasions referred to Carlos as a friend and a wrongly vilified good guy fighting for Palestinian rights. Those comments caused international controversy, with France formally protesting Chavez's remarks. But for the most part, Carlos the Jackal has faded from the headlines, a 1,970 relic held in a 21st century cell. In a candid moment in 2017, Carlos, then in his late 60s, boasted that he had personally killed around 80 people, more than anyone else in the Palestinian resistance. Whether inflated or not, the number underscores the bloody legacy of his career. Indeed, at least 80 deaths have been attributed to his operations, and countless more were injured. To his followers, the dwindling few who still see him as an anti-imperialist soldier, he remains a symbol of armed struggle. To the rest of the world, he is remembered as a cold-blooded murderer, a mastermind of terror who hijacked airplanes and bombed trains without pity or remorse. The story of Carlos the Jackal is a true saga of the Cold War era. A privileged young man turned extremist zealot, a cunning outlaw who hopped continents with ease, a master of disguises and aliases who evaded the combined might of dozens of intelligence agencies for years. He was a man who used cosmetic surgery, fake passports, and the protection of superpowers to stay one step ahead of justice. For a time, he lived two lives. In the West, he was a phantom on Interpol's most wanted lists, while in the East, he sipped coffee on Berlin's boulevards with a pistol on his belt, protected by a state that found him useful. But ultimately, the world grew too small for Carlos. As the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted and his hideouts disappeared, the Jackal found himself cornered. In the end, it was not an enemy's bullet that took him down, but a betrayal and a syringe, proof that even the most hunted man can be caught when the conditions align. Today, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez awakens each morning not in a safe house or a luxury flat under a false name, but in a prison cell. He will likely die behind those walls, as his multiple life sentences leave no chance for release. Carlos, the Jackal's reign of terror is over, but the scars of his deeds remain in the memories of victims and in the annals of international crime. His tale serves as a reminder of a tumultuous time when ideology fueled violence across borders, and one man's ego and fanaticism cost many innocent lives. It's a story of fervor and fear, of a cat and mouse game spanning decades, and of the relentless pursuit of justice that eventually caught up with the world's most infamous fugitive. Asterisk. Thank you for watching this true crime documentary on Dark Case Desk. If you found the story of Carlos the Jackal engaging and informative, please remember to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories from around the world. We have many more cases to uncover, and your support helps us continue to shed light on dark cases. Until next time, stay safe and take care. Asterisk.